Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our last program here at the Wayzata Historical Society that will be broadcast virtually. This is our third and final virtual program, and our programs that will come up later in the year will be back in person, so we're very, very happy about that. Um, Before we begin here on this program about the streetcar boats, I would like to remind you to please mute your microphone. That makes it so that we don't have feedback, so we'd very much appreciate that. All right, so welcome everyone once again, and welcome to our third and final virtual program here at the Wayzata Historical Society. This is called Yellow Jackets, the story of Lake Minnetonka's streetcar boats. My name is Aaron Person. I am the president of the Wayzata Historical Society, and I am also one of the Minnehaha's captains and have been for quite a few years. So I'm really excited to bring this program to you. It's kind of at the intersection of a couple of things that are near and dear to my heart, and it's all relevant to our Lake Minnetonka, Wayzata, and other communities around the lake as well. So the streetcar boats, I'm sure most of you, if you're joining tonight, are familiar with the streetcar boats. They actually came around in 1906 and were one of our earlier forms of transportation in the lake area. But they actually came in the kind of in the middle of Lake Minnetonka history. It wasn't the earliest form of transportation or the era of the lake's history. Before the streetcar boats came around, it was actually an epoch of Lake Minnetonka's history called the Glory Years. So this would have been in the late 1800s, the 1880s, 1890s, when Lake Minnetonka became a major vacation destination for the wealthy visitors from the southern and eastern United States. Also some people from Europe as well, I believe. And during this time, there were many large resorts and hotels that began to appear around the lake. The first being the Hotel St. Louis in Deep Haven in 1879. The other two big hotels on the lake were the Lake Park Hotel in Tonka Bay, and also the biggest one, the Hotel Lafayette, which was in Minnetonka Beach. The Lafayette, I believe, had accommodations for 400 people, and it was about 800 feet long, so it was by far the largest hotel ever to stand on the lake. It burned to the ground in 1897, however. During that time, there were also large, big steamboats on the lake, much larger than the streetcar boats like the Minnehaha. And these boats, like the Belle of Minnetonka, exceeded, many of them were in excess of 100 feet long. But in the case of the Belle of Minnetonka, the largest steamboat ever to ply the waters of Lake Minnetonka, it measured 300 feet in length. So here's a picture of the city of St. Louis. This was the first super big boat on Lake Minnetonka. This was about 165 feet long and was operated by the Minneapolis or the St. Louis Railway Company, headed by William Washburn. The other boat was the Belle of Minnetonka. This was the largest one ever to operate on Lake Minnetonka, 300 feet long. It originally actually came from the river system, Mississippi and Ohio rivers. It used to be called the Phil Sheridan, but they renamed it the Belle of Minnetonka when they moved it here in pieces and reassembled it. And this one was operated, or owned, I should say, by the company that was headed by James J. Hill, who also operated the railroad.
Hi, Aaron.
By the turn of the century in the 1900s, the metropolitan area of Minneapolis and St. Paul really expanded a great degree. And this was all stemmed by the milling industries. First, it was the lumber industry, but then it became the flour milling industry, all centered around St. Anthony Falls in downtown Minneapolis. And this really created a huge population boom for the city, and the Twin Cities really became an economic center for the upper Midwest. And the Twin Cities became a large metropolis of more than 600,000 residents during that time. Now, being that they became a big city, you needed a transportation system and a network to go along with it. So the Twin City Rapid Transit Company formed around this time in the 1890s, and the TCRT, as it was called, expanded very rapidly under Chairman Thomas Lowry. It's probably a familiar name if you've spent any time around the Twin Cities. The streetcars reached Excelsior in 1905, so it took quite a while. And Excelsior, of course, is on the south shore of Lake Minnetonka. Streetcars never came to Wayzata, actually. Wayzata was served by trains by the Great Northern Railway, so they didn't have to come to Wayzata, but they did reach Excelsior in the fall of 1905, and they also reached Tonka Bay and Deep Haven as well. Now, the streetcar company, I should note, was more of a real estate company in how they made their profits. So they would build these lines out to basically the middle of nowhere in many cases, and say modern day Richfield, for example, it might have been a cornfield back in the day. But when they extended a line out there, that increased the property value immediately surrounding the line. They would sell that land off, and it would be developed, and that was how they made their large profits at the streetcar company. The fairs didn't really do as much of that. So out here on Lake Minnetonka during this time, around 1900, turn of the century, Lake Minnetonka was really transitioning from being more of a resort community for the nation's wealthy tourists and was becoming more of a residential area for people who had made it well in the Twin Cities, also people of more modest means as well. You can see imaged here are Ferndale. That was where many of the moguls of the day built their summer estates. Also, more middle-class families built cottages around the lake as well. So, transportation around the lake remained difficult around this time, however. The lake really was the only way to get around quickly, and that was both, I suppose, in the winter and the summertime. In the winter, you might have used more sleighs and skis, perhaps, but in the summer, it was all by boat, steamboat. And roads had not yet been improved around the lake by around this period. And also, automobiles were just in their infancy at this time and were just not accessible to average people. So, how do you solve this problem for people who are living around the lake at this time that needed to get through their jobs in Minneapolis or St. Paul? Now, there were quite a few families living around the lake by this time, and many of them they worked downtown or they owned small businesses or whatnot. And Lake Minnetonka, having 125 miles of shoreline, more or less, was not a practical area to build streetcar track all around that 100-mile of shoreline or more. So rather than build all of that track, the company had the brilliant idea to just build steamboats that would service the people who lived around the lake at this time. Now, officially, these streetcar boats or the steamboats would be called express boats. That was their official name, but the local community referred to them belovedly as streetcar boats because they resembled streetcars in every detail possible. They were painted yellow and red, just like the streetcars. The official colors were actually canary yellow and oxide red, and that's officially what they called the color scheme. The windows were also the exact same pocket windows that were used on the streetcars, so they actually lowered down into the hull in order to be opened. Also, the seats were the exact same, and these were caned seats found on streetcars across the country, but they were definitely on the Twin Cities streetcars as well. Now, there were 6 boats total at first that were built over the winter of 1905-1906, and they were all named after popular stops on the Twin Cities streetcar system. So we had the Como, Hopkins, Harriet, White Bear, Minnehaha, and Stillwater. Forgive me if I'm missing any of the 6, but I think I listed all 6 of them there. But all of those places are kind of their familiar names around the Twin Cities because they are popular destinations even to this day around the Twin Cities area. And the Minnehaha in particular was named after the streetcar stop at the 50th and Hiawatha, or where 50th and Hiawatha is today, just by Minnehaha Falls in South Minneapolis. So we like to say that the Minnehaha's spiritual namesake is the modern day light rail station at Minnehaha Falls. Now these boats, what they did, they really provided lake residents with fast and reliable transportation for the first time, really. Before these express boats were put into service, the steamboats around Lake Minnetonka were much less reliable. They were not as fast, and they didn't operate on these hourly schedules like the express boats would. So they were very reliable, very trustworthy in their times and schedules. It took an hour to get from Excelsior to Wayzata, and something like that to get out to the west end of the lake as well. And they were very serious about keeping a strict schedule and keeping on time. And it was just like bus rapid transit today, but which we call BRT. But back in these days, I suppose we would have called it boat rapid transit. Now, around the lake, there were 26 designated landings that increased and decreased a little bit over the years, but on average, it was about 26 designated landings. And those were in neighborhoods and communities all around the lake, primarily to service the commuters and people going to work or going into town to get groceries, anything like that. There were also tourists who would ride the boats as well, day tourists who would go out and enjoy the scenery of the lake and whatnot. But they would also stop at private docks, which is the most extraordinary thing. So if you held them down with a white handkerchief, you could hail down a streetcar boat from your private dock. It might pull up to your dock if you're lucky, or if it was deep enough, and you could get on and take it into Excelsior or Tonka Bay, Deep Haven, whatever was closest. And then from there, take the streetcar into Minneapolis. And from the lake down to Minneapolis, the streetcar system only took, that streetcar ride only took 45 minutes. So really, this was basically the same amount of time that it takes today, except this was well over 100 years ago. So I think that's pretty remarkable. And you got a nice boat ride on top of it. So here are kind of the three men who made all of this happen. So from left to right is Charles Lowry. He was the chairman of the Twin City Rapid Transit Company for many years, and he was kind of the father of that company. By the time that the streetcar boats came around, he was more just in charge of the financial aspects of the company. So he was kind of the financier of the whole operation. But the guy in the middle was Kelvin Goodrich, who was the vice president of the company, and also did other things for the company. But Kelvin Goodrich was really the man behind all of this, and he doesn't get as much credit as Lowry does, but really this whole Lake Minnetonka scheme was really Goodrich's idea. And I should mention that he also lived on the lake, so he had particular interest in it during the summertime. Now over on the right side is Wayzata boat builder Royal Corbin Moore, and he had Moore Boat Works in Wayzata. And he was the man who was commissioned to design, and his company was commissioned to cut the parts for the boats. And all the parts were cut in Wayzata, right by the depot where we are right now. And he was one of Minnesota's most prominent boat builders during this time. But his boat works here in Wayzata was not big enough to actually have the boats be assembled in. So the parts were actually sent to the streetcar shop at 31st and Nicollet in South Minneapolis and assembled there. They were then later hauled out to Excelsior on flatbed rail cars. So yeah, just a reminder to everyone to please mute your microphones so that we don't have feedback. Thank you, we greatly appreciate that. So here's a photo of a brand new streetcar boat coming out of the shop at 31st and Nicollet in the spring of 1906. Now, the name had not been painted on yet, so we actually don't know exactly what boat this is. Good chance it could be Minnehaha. We're not sure, but I'd like to think it is the Minnehaha. And you can tell they were put on the flatbed rail cars here, and they were brought out to Excelsior, supposedly done at night so as not to draw a crowd, and they were launched into the lake in early May 1906 in Excelsior. We know that the Minnehaha was definitely the first one to be put into the lake and fired up. That would have been on May 2nd, 1906. The Stillwater would have been the second one to be put in the lake. So here's an interior shot of one of the streetcar boats. This is what it would have looked like early on in 1906 or so. You can tell it looks just like the interior of a streetcar, essentially, from this period, except it had a boiler and a steam engine right in the middle. Now, these steam engines would have been, or the boilers, I should say, were fired by coal back in these times. The present day Minnehaha is no longer fired by coal for a number of reasons. But they were fired by coal, and it was a high pressure boiler, and that would have powered a triple expansion steam engine for a single propeller. Now, in this photo, you can see that you can see the windows clear across to the rear or the stern of the boat, and this is indicative that it is early on because it shows that a head or a restroom on the boat had not been added yet. That was done later on, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Also note the electric lights in the alcoves next to the windows and also on top of the above the aisles there. The boats were advertised as having electric lights, which was kind of a big fancy thing at that time, and they sure made the public aware that the boats were powered with electric lights, equipped with electric lights. Here's another view of the interior of the vessel, of one of the vessels. You can see the triple expansion steam engine over on the left here. The windows at this time, this indicates that it was a little bit later on, a couple years later than the other picture. You can see that they added curtains to the windows. I don't know why anyone would want curtains on a beautiful boat ride, but people, I suppose, had different tastes back then. So here's this is a map of the Twin Cities streetcar system from the early 1900s, 1908 perhaps this is. This is only half of this streetcar system. This is the western half, and you can see downtown Minneapolis is on the right. Excelsior and Lake Minnetonka is on the left. And that's about 15 miles between the lake and Minneapolis. Now going east, of course, there is all of St. Paul, and on the eastern end of the streetcar system was Stillwater. So between Stillwater and Excelsior, that's about 40 miles in between. You could get anywhere on the system for a relatively cheap price. 10 cents round or one way, I believe, was a one-way trip, at least from Lake Minnetonka. And you could get there quickly, cheaply, and you could just about get anywhere in the Twin Cities at this time. So here's a view of the wharf in Excelsior, and this would have been in 1906. Now, we know that this is 1906 because for a couple of reasons. One is that the beautiful terminal that they built here had not been finished yet, or even it looks like they hadn't even started it yet. But eventually, I'll show a picture here in a second. There was a beautiful terminal building built here where people could transfer onto the streetcar and wait at the waiting station and then come onto the boat at the wharf here. And but this was it was not completed right away when the boats were put into service. So we know that this is probably in about, I would say, June 1906. But you can see the streetcar coming right up to the water here. This would have been on Excelsior Bay. And some of these buildings, interestingly enough, in the background, do still apparently stand today. So this is the building that I was talking about, and this is a beautiful. I don't even know what style to consider it. It's kind of Mediterranean revival slash mission revival slash arts and crafts kind of thing. Very unique structure, uh, very interesting, and definitely a unique thing for Minnesota at this time. And you can see it had a big clock on it on the front side facing the lake there, so you could tell the time and tell when the boats were coming. Right above this clock, right below the roof there in the center part, that was where there was an employee there. I don't know exactly what his title would have been, but this would have been basically like the watchtower for the boats or the control tower, so they could keep track of the boats or monitor what was going on. So here are, I'm just going to go through a couple photos from this early period of the boats. This is the streetcar boat White Bear at Shady Island on the Upper Lake, and this is a very popular postcard that you see all over the place. But it's a very nice, typical scene of the period. This was the Harriet, and you can tell that they really did not have the same codes that we do today as far as capacity goes. The capacity back in 1906 was advertised. Um, they listed different numbers for different publications, but some publications listed 135 passengers, which I just cannot imagine how overly crowded that would have been. As Minnehaha's capacity today is only 90 passengers, and even that is rather crowded. So I really cannot imagine having 135 passengers on board. You can tell this here was a full boat. The name Harriet is just about underwater there, and you can tell it's pretty heavily loaded. Another interesting thing about the streetcar boats was that typically passengers would board and disembark from the gangway, one of two gangways on each side of the boat, right in the center. I don't know if you can see my mouse here. The gangway is the big door right in the middle. But for certain docks where it wasn't deep enough, or if the dock wasn't long enough or whatnot, passengers could board and disembark from one of the front windows, and you can kind of see this on the right side here and also on the other photo too, is what they're doing. But you can see people coming in and out of the window here, and they could hop on and off from the dock there. I don't imagine that was too safe, but it was a service that the boats provided, and people, I'm sure, really appreciated it where docks were not deep enough or long enough. So I'll talk a little bit about the routing of the streetcar boats here. So there are a few different periods of the routing that the boats did have, or the routes that the company provided. I mentioned earlier that at first there were 4 routes that initially started and stopped, or started and ended in Excelsior. And those routes would have been the signature route, I suppose, would have been from Excelsior to Wayzata and back. Another route would have been Excelsior to Spring Park and back, and Excelsior to Minnetonka Beach and back, and also Excelsior to Zumbra Heights and back. That lasted only for 2 years. That would have been 1906 and 1907. That changed in 1908 when the streetcar company actually built a spur line off of the Tonka Bay streetcar track. And when they built the spur line to the Wildhurst neighborhood in Tonka Bay, they had 3 boats on the upper lake and 3 boats on the lower lake. And the routes on the upper lake started at Wildhurst and ended at Wildhurst. Routes on the lower lake started in Excelsior and it ended in Excelsior. That lasted between 1908 and 1912. But then finally, the final change came in 1913 when they actually scrapped that in favor of one continuous loop. And when they did this, this lasted a long time. And this was considered a masterpiece of route scheduling for transportation people. Even to this day, people kind of drool at how just wonderful this system was and how genius it was. But the boats operated on one continuous loop on an hourly basis, and they were scheduled so it would be coordinated so that streetcars would be arriving at the dock at the same time that the boats would have been coming in. So people wouldn't really have to wait at all at any of the landings where the streetcars came to the lake. And as I said, that was just really considered masterful transit planning, and that did last through to 1926, although in the 1920s, when ridership dropped off, the frequency became less frequent. I should also mention that Mound was serviced for a couple of years sporadically between 1908 and 1909. I can't really find any maps where it's actually shown that they went to Mound regularly, but we do know that they did stop there sporadically those 2 years. But we don't know exactly why Mound was scrapped. They would have stopped at Chapman's, which was far away from the train tracks. So that could possibly be why they scrapped that service, because the train tracks in Mound actually went through downtown Mound, which is not right on the lake, and probably would have just been easier for people in Mound to commute on the trains rather than take the boat and then transfer from the boat to the streetcar. So that's the likely reason that they scrapped Mound. Crane Island, another island kind of out towards Mound on the upper lake, that was a stop that was added in by 1911. It could have been a little bit earlier than that. But that was added at the heavy lobbying of the Crane Island people. A couple of other islands were also serviced by the streetcar boats, like Big Island, famously. The boats actually did not service the amusement park on a regular basis. I'll come back to that in a second. But they did service the cottage communities out on Big Island at both Oakwood and Crown Point. And lastly, a fun little tidbit is that Zumbra Heights, way out on the western end of the lake, most westerly point of the entire streetcar system, really not easy to get to before the streetcar boats. This was always served from 1906 all the way to 1926, and there really isn't anything at Zumbra Heights, but it should be mentioned that Calvin Goodrich, the vice president of the company, the mastermind of this whole Lake Minnetonka scheme, he had his summer estate out in Zumbra Heights, so he made sure that Zumbra Heights was always served by the streetcar boats so he could get in to and from Minneapolis very easily. And also, since he was a executive of the company, he didn't have to pay a fare. So here's a map of what it would have been in 1906 and 1907. So this would have been the first iteration of the streetcar boat routes. And you can see the routes here, the 4 different routes going to Minnetonka Beach, Spring Park, Zumbra Heights, and Wayzata, and everything coming to and from Excelsior. Now this route going straight from Excelsior to Big Island Park, the amusement park on Big Island, that was not really a streetcar boat route. That was actually served more by the Twin City Rapid Transit Company's ferry boats that were double-ended paddle wheelers. And I'll show a picture of those here in a second. So here is a photo of one of those ferry boats that just went nonstop between Excelsior and Big Island Park. These were at first 108 feet long, and they were extended after their first year because they were rebuilt because of a number of problems that they had with them. But this was the Minneapolis. The other 2 were the St. Paul and the Minnetonka, and these were really the workhorses that got people to and from the amusement park. The streetcar boats would stop out there occasionally, and for big events when they had live music and whatnot. But these were really the amusement park boats. The streetcar boats were definitely more for commuters and the occasional sightseeing tourists. So this is a map of the second iteration of the routing that they had, starting in 1908 and going to 1912. And this is when they divided the routing in two. So they had the two routes starting from Wildhurst, one going to Spring Park, one going to Zumbra Heights. And they had the two routes starting from Excelsior, one going to Wayzata, one going to Minnetonka Beach. And they had the spur line. You can see the red line here. Streetcar coming up to Tonka Bay, a little spur line to Wildhurst. There's also a branch line that came into Deep Haven here. So there were actually 4 different places at the lake where streetcars could be reached. Here's a photo of a streetcar boat at, I believe it's the White Bear, at Chapman's at Mound. So this is proof that they did stop at Mound on Cook's Bay. And again, this was just sporadically for 2 years, 1908, 1909. And here's a photo of Calvin Goodrich's summer estate in Zumbra Heights. This is his summer home, and was designed by an architect named Leroy Buffington, who also designed the buildings out at Big Island Park, the amusement park on Big Island, which was also built by the streetcar company that Calvin Goodrich was basically in charge of. And this is a map of the final iteration of the routing that they had. And this is when it was one continuous loop that could be accessed from anywhere. Excelsior was of course still the main hub for streetcar connections, but this is lasted from 1913 all the way to 1926. They operated on one continuous loop. It was coordinated so that the streetcars would come right up to the dock right when the boats were arriving. And they operated at first, for many years at least, on an hourly basis, on a tight, strict schedule. So I'll talk a little bit about the fleet here, about the boats themselves. I mentioned there were 6 of them originally, and they were all designed by Royal C. Moore, the Wayzata boat builder and a businessman who was involved with several different ventures here in Wayzata. But since Moore Boat Works was not big enough, the parts were cut here in Wayzata, but they were assembled in South Minneapolis and hauled out to the lake on the flatbed rail cars. Each of these boats were 70 feet long and approximately 15 feet wide. It was actually 14 feet 10 inches, if you really care to know. You'll notice that in the photos that the early pictures of the boats, they don't have these canopies on top of them. And I don't know if you can see my cursors, but I'm kind of hovering over that now. But those canopies were actually added in about 1911 or 1912 or so on at least 5 of the 6 boats. And that was primarily, for one, to protect people from the sun, because it wasn't really cool to be tan back then. But also, more importantly, it was because the soot would fall from on the aft portion of the vessels and fall on people's nice work clothes or white dresses or whatever they were wearing. And they were powered by coal, and you didn't want to have coal soot all over you when you were going into work or going into town. Ridership on the boats did very, very well. They had, I think, in excess of 300,000 riders in 1907. Kind of tapered off a little bit after that initial bang, if you will. But ridership did remain above 200,000 all the way until 1918, and all the way until World War I, basically. And a 7th vessel was actually added to the fleet in 1915, and that boat would have been called the Excelsior. It was a little bit different from the rest of the boats. It was 73 feet long instead of 70. And it had other little differences to it as well. And it was not designed by Royal Moore like the other boats, because by that time, Royal Moore he had sold his business to Eugene Remaley to become the Remaley Boat Company. So Moore was no longer in business, so they the company kind of designed the Excelsior on their own, and it kind of shows, if you ask me. But I'll show you a picture of the Excelsior a little bit later. So here's kind of a Brady Bunch shot of the original 6 streetcar boats, the Como, Harriet, Hopkins, Minnehaha, Stillwater, and White Bear. These are all kind of the glamour shots that the company used for publications and for postcards and whatnot. You could tell that they did go pretty fast, and they could go 12 miles an hour or so. That was really a new thing for Lake Minnetonka at the time to have this fast and reliable transportation. Here's an image. This is actually courtesy of the Excelsior Historical Society. Sorry, I think I forgot to put that credit here. But this was the Minnehaha in, I would say this is 1907. And a couple of reasons I can tell is because they modified the boats a little bit in 1907. You know, they have a year to test them out and really see what worked well, what didn't work well. And in 1907, they heightened the funnels of the boats so that the soot would not be blowing in people's faces. It was so you can tell that the smokestack is a little bit higher. You can kind of see where the original height would have been. So that's one change that they made. Another change is that they added a second rub rail below the upper rub rail of the boats, because when they came up to these docks and stuff, they were just banging up against the docks, and the boats were getting all scratched up and stuff. So they added a second rub rail to preserve the paint job of the boats. And then here, this is when they added the canopies, the famous canopies that you see in a lot of the photographs. This is added. It would have been in 1911 or 1912, definitely by 1912. They added these canopies so people wouldn't have the sun and coal soot coming down on them. And this would have been added to at least 5 of the 6 original boats. The Hopkins, one of the boats, could have possibly come originally with the canopy, because there is no known photo of the Hopkins without a canopy. But we know that the entire fleet had these by about 1912. Here's an image from the Westonka Historical Society. And this is off of Casco Point. This wonderful boathouse actually is still standing today on Casco Point. But you can tell this is after the canopy was added, and it was listing a little bit. You can kind of tell. And these canopies really they picked up the wind, and the boats were really a little less stable because of them. But it must have been worthwhile because they did keep them on for the remainder of their lives. But you can really see that the boats became a lot more top heavy with the canopies on. Another change came in 1913, 1914. So in 1913, it was advertised that the boats were given a brand new color scheme, and it was kind of like a rebranding effort that the company did in 1913. As far as the color scheme goes, they kind of added a lot more of this olive green color, but on the bow there, that would have been painted a dark green color. They also painted the area around the gangways that same color, and other areas on the boat as well. Then by 1914, we know that electric signage was also added to the boats up above the helm there, up by the spotlight. So there was no more of the painted signs, like I'll go back here. So the Express for Wayzata, Express for Zumbra, etc. Changed it so it would be, instead of a painted sign, it was a lit up electric sign, much more modern. And here, this is an image of the Harriet. You can tell the gangway area had it was painted dark green. And here's an image of the Excelsior, the 7th streetcar boat that was added in 1915. And as I mentioned, this one was not designed by Royal Moore because he was no longer in the boat building business. And this boat had several differences compared to the different boats. For one, the deck was actually, the cabin roof, or the sun deck, was actually flat. It was flat with the horizon, not sheared with the hull line like the other boats had. It wasn't curved. Also, the canopy didn't have the little hump over the gangway like the other boats had. There were some other differences as well. The railings were a little bit different, and just kind of the shape was a little bit different. But to the average person, it blended in just similar to the other boats. This is a photo. This would have been sometime, I would say this is probably the 1920s that this photo was taken. But sometime in the teens, heads or restrooms were added to the streetcar boats, and they would have been located in the rear. And the boats each would have had two heads, one for the ladies and one for the gentlemen. And you can tell that this photo that they were definitely added by this time because there was a pipe here going up to the above the canopy for ventilation there. And, yeah, so that would have been added sometime in the 1910s or so. So I'll just go through some photos of kind of what life with the streetcar boats would have been like. And these are the crew members of the streetcar boats. There were a lot more crew members, of course, but this is just a couple different crews. On the left here would have been the crew of the Stillwater. But each boat required at least 3 people to operate. They tried to keep it at 3, so to keep the overhead as low as possible. But they each had a captain or a pilot, as they were called, and a engineer to do the steam engine work, and they also had a purser to deal with the handling of the lines and dealing with collecting passenger fares and whatnot and keeping people happy. Now, the captains and the engineers, basically, they, for the most part, stayed with the vessels that they were assigned to. They could move around if need be, but they liked to stay with the vessels that they were assigned to. The pursers, on the other hand, they went all over the place. They kind of didn't matter what boat that they were working on, so they were kind of more flexible. But it was most important for the engineers to stay with their vessel if possible, because with a steam engine it's kind of like a living organism, and you kind of get to know it like a personality. And it was really important that they stayed with their vessels so that they could they really knew them like a person, like the back of their hand, really. Here are these would have been the 2 crew members assigned to the Minnehaha. The captain of the Minnehaha, for the most part, unless something unusual happened, was R.T. Mann, and this is a photo of him on the left. On the right, this is Orville McCormick, and he was an Excelsior resident. He was the Minnehaha's primary engineer, and he was the engineer for the Minnehaha's entire life between 1906 and 1926. Here's another image of the crew a little bit later on. You can tell, Orville McCormick in the middle definitely aged a little bit in this photo. This image is courtesy of the Minnesota Streetcar Museum. Here is an image of a woman waiting at the waiting station or the transfer terminal in Excelsior. And you can tell there's a nice breezeway right through the buildings, and people like to wait there for the boats if they had to, but oftentimes they didn't have to wait at all. On the right is just a different woman, just on the deck, enjoying the breeze and enjoying the views of the lake as she was getting where she needed to be. Here is a photo of just a family on the dock in this is probably in Excelsior. But funny, the little baby laying down on the dock is playing with the camera, which I imagine would have been a very expensive toy to play with back then. Which is kind of funny. Here's a different family. This is a sightseeing family. They were just tourists out to see the sights on Lake Minnetonka. This was actually sent into us by one of Minnehaha's fans a few years ago, so we thank them for that. This is another family up on top of the deck after the canopy had been added, of course. But even with the sun deck covered with the canopy, they all apparently still needed to wear hats as well. Double protection, I guess. And then I just love this photo. This is, I'm not exactly sure where this photo is. I think it possibly was at Crane Island, but it's a beautiful image of people waiting at the dock, and the guy on the right actually looks like a crew member. So this didn't last forever. All good things must come to an end. And this really happened in the 1920s when local roads were improved in the area. Now, ridership I mentioned was very high, and many people relied on the boats for all of these years. This lasted all the way until 1918. Ridership was above 200,000 every single year until 1918. Went below that for a couple of years, but in 1920 and 1921, it actually rose up to above 200,000 once again. But after 1921, the ridership just plummeted. If you were looking at a graph, it was just like a very steep drop after 1921. I'm not exactly sure when Excelsior Boulevard or Superior Boulevard were built, but they probably would have been built and improved around that time, which could have been a big reason for that steep decline in that specific year. So after 1922, after the ridership started to plummet like that, cuts were made to service. They kept that continuous loop thing going, but they became less frequent and took some of the boats out of service after 1922. Ridership, however, continued to go down, and service actually ended in 1926. It became so bad that the company decided to just pull the plug at that point, and they ended all service in sometime in the summer of 1926. Three of the boats were scuttled that year. That would have been Minnehaha, Como, and White Bear. Now, scuttled, that's just a fancy word for purposely sunk, and which I know that sounds crazy, right? But that's just what people did back then when they wanted to get rid of things. They just sunk or threw things in the lake, which, yeah, it's just what people did. But the company actually did try to sell the boats at first, but they didn't really have any takers except for one of the boats. The Hopkins actually was sold, and that was used as an excursion boat on Lake Minnetonka, known as, it was renamed the Minnetonka, and that was on the lake all the way until 1949. But that one was also purposely sunk in 1949. So in total, out of the seven boats that operated, four of them in total were scuttled or purposely sunk. So Como, Hopkins, Minnehaha, White Bear, and the three others would have eventually just been scrapped. So the Stillwater and Harriet were just scrapped in about 1927 or so. And all of these boats were, before anything happened to them, they were stripped of their parts. The cabin roofs were ripped off and everything, and stripped of their parts of anything valuable that they could sell as scrap. The Excelsior, that seventh streetcar boat, there is a theory that, or a report that the Excelsior was actually sold to outfit in Red Wing, and it was turned into the cabin was ripped off and everything. But there is a report that was actually used as a tugboat on the Mississippi River in Red Wing for a while before it was scrapped. But I haven't been able to prove that yet. So here's a picture of the Minnetonka, which would have previously been the Hopkins, one of the original 6 streetcar boats. Now this one was sold to a, it wasn't George Hopkins, but it was the other prominent captain in Excelsior. Forgive me for not remembering his name right now. But he purchased this vessel and used it as an excursion boat, belovedly so, out of Excelsior for many years, all the way until 1949. In the 1930s, it was actually converted. The steam engine was ripped out of it, and a diesel engine was put in. So when it was scuttled in 1949, it actually was no longer a steam vessel. A funny thing about this boat was that it had a flamingo out on the front deck. I don't know if you can see that there, but right in front of the helm, there's actually a flappy flamingo figurine out there. Um, they also painted it white, so they painted it. It wasn't yellow anymore; it was white during this time. And they also added these awnings to the side of the boat as well. So here, this is a very kind of crude graphic of the approximate location of where these boats were scuttled. Um, these locations are very approximate, so you should never go by this by any means. But it's just kind of to give you an idea of the general area where the boats were scuttled in 1926, and for the Hopkins it was in 1949. Um, but there are a number of other boats out in this area too that were scuttled at different times. So this is kind of like the shipwreck graveyard area of Lake Minnetonka. Um, but you can see the four streetcar boats there: the White Bear, Hopkins, Como, Minnehaha. The Hercules was a tugboat scuttled sometime in the 1920s. The sternwheeler would have been the sternwheeler called the George Excelsior. It was originally the George, then it became the Excelsior. I know it's confusing because some of these names, like Excelsior or Minnetonka, even Minnehaha, were used for a number of different boats over the years. So the Minnehaha that we all know and love was actually the second Minnehaha um, on Lake Minnetonka, believe it or not. We actually don't know exactly where the Minnehaha was scuttled. We don't really have the GPS coordinates for that, but all of these other wrecks have been, since that graphic was made, they have been properly identified and located and registered as archaeology sites. So I'll play here a video for you from an organization called Maritime Heritage Minnesota. They're an underwater archaeology group. And this video is a survey work of the Hopkins Minnetonka, which was, it says, built in 1906 and scuttled in 1949 as the Minnetonka. There's a picture of it as the Hopkins. And Maritime Heritage Minnesota is an underwater archaeology group. They are the people that primarily have done most of the documentation work of all of the wrecks around Lake Minnetonka. I believe they're in excess of 80 identified wrecks on the lake so far, so that's pretty amazing for a relatively little lake of our size. So here's this is what the Hopkins looks like at the bottom of the lake in, I'd say it's about 50 or 60 feet of water, maybe a little more perhaps. Um, but this one actually has a little bit of the superstructure left on the wreck, so you can see some of the window frames and things there. That's why I'm showing this one in particular, is because it's definitely the kind of the most interesting wreck out of the original streetcar boats, because it does have some of that superstructure intact, which the other ones do not have that. It's just totally ripped off on the other boats. This, of course, is between Big Island and Brackett's Point, in the big water, as we call it. I should mention shipwrecks are in Minnesota, and indeed, actually, I believe in all 50 United States, are considered archaeological resources, and these ones are actually officially recorded. And it is illegal to loot or take anything from the wrecks or to purposely damage the wrecks in any way. So they really are protected sites at the bottom of the lake. It's the stern, torpedo stern. Uh, was very fashionable for the boat building of that time. Torpedo stern was it was kind of modern, but it also just looked very stylish and provided stability for the boats, and also allowed for them to be able to go somewhat fast next to the shoreline, because with the torpedo stern, the boats didn't leave a wake, which is really big advantage of having a stern like that. So hopefully you saw that was the wreck of the Hopkins Minnetonka. And next we'll go on to the famous Minnehaha, our beloved Minnehaha. So the Minnehaha it lay on the bottom of the lake for 54 years between 1926 and 1980. Now, in 1979, a local diver from the just north of Wayzata, named Jerry Provost, he discovered the wreck for himself, and he spent quite a lot of time looking for the wreck, or for any of the streetcar boats for that matter. He didn't really know it was the Minnehaha at that time, but went out and he owned an underwater construction company, and so kind of did this as a fun hobby. And spare time, him and his guy working for him, he sent a diver down, and on the radio when he dropped the diver down to the bottom of the lake, the diver radioed. He said, "What did you do? Set up a gem for me down here?" And they had descended right upon the hull of the Minnehaha, which had been laying down there in the depths since 1926. Now, after this discovery, kind of a plan started to hatch, and Jerry Provost was contacted by Fred Pierce, the Excelsior amusement park guy, go figure, who also owned the Mai Tai restaurant in Excelsior. And Fred Pierce actually commissioned Jerry Provost to salvage or raise the streetcar boat. They didn't know which one it was at this time, but he commissioned him to raise it for the purposes of using it as like a lakeside lounge at this restaurant. Kind of a very bizarre idea, but that's how the history happened, interestingly enough. So that's kind of how this whole project got started, and Jerry really took it to heart and really became determined to salvage and raise this streetcar boat that had been discovered. This plan it took quite a bit of planning to do it, so it took an entire year to actually execute the task. They sought permission actually from both the state and also from what they thought was the previous owner of the boat. For some reason, we don't know exactly why, but the people involved thought or wanted to think that this boat in question was the Hopkins. And the Hopkins was scuttled, as I mentioned, in 1949. At that point, that would have only been 31 years in the past. So that was not officially a historic resource yet, because it had not been 50 years, which is the threshold for historic resources, actually. So they actually sought permission from the state. The state said get permission from the property owner, the previous property owner, which they did get from the last owner of the Hopkins Minnetonka before it was scuttled. And that owner, who was still alive, actually did give permission to raise it, and the state gave permission, thinking that this boat was the Hopkins. And lo and behold, they set about to raise this vessel in 1980. Not knowing that it was actually an illegal act. But in August 1980, they had a crew of about 20 people or so. Bill Nickum, the barge operator, Lake Minnetonka Portable Dredge, got involved. The Hedgie Provost Company was involved. They had 3 cranes, 3 barges. They had, I think, 8 airbags and a crew of about 20 or so, multiple divers. It took about 5 days to get this thing to actually break free from the bottom of the lake. And the bottom the hull was kind of stuck in the mud down at the bottom. And they actually had to have divers go down and with hoses, with big industrial hoses, suck the mud out from underneath the vessel. They had to actually bore tunnels in the mud, under the water, under the boat, underneath it, in order to get these straps underneath it so that the cranes could start tugging and lifting. And they attempted to actually raise it a couple times and it failed. But then on at least I think the third attempt, it finally broke free, and on August 29th, 1980, the Minnehaha actually finally broke free to the surface of Lake Minnetonka for the first time in 54 years. After that, it sat in dry dock. It was towed to shore, to mainland, in Shorewood at Nickham's barge yard in Shorewood. However, it then sat in dry dock for a period of 10 years. And I say on here just because it was due to complicated circumstances. Well, it actually sat up on shore because it was revealed after the hull started drying out. The paint job became more visible, and the name Minnehaha appeared on 4 places on the hull. So they thought they had the Hopkins, which had been scuttled only 31 years before. Ended up that it was actually the Minnehaha that had been raised. It was not the Hopkins. Minnehaha, scuttled in 1926, had been on the bottom for 54 years. So it was actually considered an historic resource and was domain of the state. So this put the state in a very confusing situation because they basically gave permission to do this, but had they known that it was the Minnehaha, not the Hopkins, they probably would not have given permission because that would have been illegal. So this was really just a very awkward situation. No one really knew what to do. There was a lot of confusion, a lot of letters going back and forth, a lot of litigation. And many years passed, and while this was happening, the boat deteriorated on mainland while it was happening, exposed to the elements, which is not good for any boat, especially a wood boat. The boat was actually more preserved at the bottom of the lake in the very cold, oxygen-depleted water. So boats are actually they're much better preserved as shipwrecks than they are as wrecks up on shore. And they so it was kind of unfortunate that this was happening while all the litigation was happening. It was actually discussed at one point that they would actually re-scuttle or re-sink the boat, but then that was viewed as violating the pollution control agency policies. So it was kind of it was like a catch-22 situation where you're doing something wrong no matter what you did. Then eventually, a few years passed, title of the vessel was transferred finally to an organization that could possibly start restoring or fundraising to restore the boat. That would have been the Inland Marine Interpretive Center, and that was run by Daryl and Laverna Leopold of Excelsior. Many of you probably know them or know of them. But they were the first owners of the boat, proper owners, after it had been raised, and that was in 1984 that title was transferred to them. However, fundraising didn't really work out through that effort, so the boat continued to sit at Nickham's in Shorewood. Then, finally, the boat was discovered on shore in this kind of sad condition by another local resident named Leo Maloche in 1989 or so, and he was just biking on the bike trail in this area, and started a conversation with another local resident named Bob Bowles, who many of you probably know, and that kind of hatched a renewed plan to restore this boat, and perhaps it would be restored fully to operational status as a steam vessel, which had been the idea was really hatched by the Leopolds for that earlier on. But in 1990, it kind of all came together. They went out to the Minnesota Transportation Museum, which could have the backing and the financing to do this, and organization to do this. And they formed the Steamboat Division of the Minnesota Transportation Museum in 1990. And the title of the Minnehaha was transferred to the MTM in 1990. It was the vessel was moved to a new restoration building, or barn as we call it, later that year, and that was located just down the bike trail in Excelsior. And beginning then, slowly at first, but then picking up after a year or two, full restoration began, and it was basically all volunteer effort and in-kind donated services, and really the community just really came together, and it was this just massive restoration effort, just astonishing. The volunteers in the community came together to restore this beautiful steamboat that had previously been a shipwreck, and this was all directed and led by Leo Maloche as director of the Minnehaha restoration project. There were a number of other leaders involved as well, and I'll talk about them a little bit too as we go along here. In total, this project took about $500,000 at least. That's documented. It would probably be more with in-kind donations. It was probably more like $1 million project, really, in 1990s money. So that would have been even more if it happened today. And also, at least 85,000 volunteer man-hours were volunteered towards the project. And again, that's just documented hours, or estimated. So it was probably considerably more than that, and it was just really just astonishing project. Restoration was finally then completed in 1996. They actually were able to launch the boat for a series of lake trials in 1995, so it actually went in the water for the first time in 1995, so they could test it for stability and to make sure the engine worked and everything. But then in 1996, on May 25, 1996, just about, it would be 25 years ago this week, she re-entered passenger service for the first time since 1926. So I have a little video here of reporting that KSTP Channel 5 did back in 1980.
Governor Wendell Anderson launched a plan to raise a historic ferry boat from the bottom of Lake Minnetonka. Despite a wide search of the lake, the wreck could not be found, but now it has been located and plans are afoot to raise it. More from Jason Davis.
Early this morning, a salvage barge was anchored over what showed up on sonar as a large hill on the flat bottom of Lake Minnetonka. Divers soon established that a wreck lay beneath. In 1926, old ferries called streetcar boats had reached the end of their useful life. They had familiar names like Como, Minnehaha, and Hopkins, but no further value. So they were taken out into deep water and sunk. With holes hacked in their sides and loads of pottery tile as ballast, they didn't drift for long before they headed for the bottom. A consortium of interested people, led by the Heggie Provost International Diving Company, are donating time, equipment, and effort to raise the ship. It's not easy. Diver Victor Cazada had been 60 feet down connecting airbags to the wreck for nearly an hour when we spoke to him. He says it's cold and dark work.
It's mostly done by braille. You feel everything around. You don't have a lot of visibility at all. You might have 6 inches. It depends on how much you've stirred up on the bottom. When you're kicking around down there, you stir up the mud so that there's very little visibility. Otherwise, you have 3-4 feet.
Until the wreck is raised later this week, no one knows exactly which boat it is. Best bet, it is the Hopkins, which last saw the light of day 75 years ago.
The greatest danger these divers face is not the frigid waters at the bottom of Lake Minnetonka, but people in large powerboats that come by to see what's going on, not recognizing this flag, which means divers below, keep clear. Jason Davis, Channel 5 Eyewitness News on Lake Minnetonka.
The odd-looking flotilla on Lake Minnetonka grew even larger today. A third crane was added in a last-ditch effort to yank the ferry from the lake's muddy bottom. And mud was a problem. Divers spent 8 hours down below today trying to clear away 7 feet of silt that covered the stern. Finally, about 6 o'clock tonight, the cranes were fired up and began tugging and pulling and straining with the weight of the 6-ton ferry that lay below. And slowly, very slowly, it began to move from its mud grave.
I can tell he's losing ground. He's actually just holding his own. Just a little more. A little more. A little more power.
As the crane strained for every foot, word among the crew and the divers spread. She was out of the mud.
Right now, I'm sure he's got it. I think he's got the boat.
Out of the mud, but not out of the woods. The boat wouldn't be safe until it was raised in shallow water, and slowly the tugs began to drag the ferry boat to shore. And as they did, the hull began to emerge to the cheers of onlookers and the champagne toasts of the crew.
Oh, no, there's the guy that started it all. That's the guy.
With the bow out of the water, divers quickly tried to identify her, but too much of the paint was gone and no one could tell if it was the Como or the Harriet or the Hopkins. 3 of the 6 boats sunk in Minnetonka between 1926 and 1948. But we do know it's not the Titanic. However, it is up, which is more than we can say for the Titanic, and one of Lake Minnetonka's mysteries has been at least partially solved. Steve Sanger, Channel 5 Eyewitness News.
This is what it looked like the day after. It actually did float on its own when it was raised, and that's because it was just so well preserved at the bottom of the lake, where it's very cold. That's Jerry Provost, the diver who directed the operation to salvage the Minnehaha. He spent the day kind of cleaning out the hull of the boat on the inside. Then they started to haul it out onto the mainland. It was an interesting effort that they undertook to get it out of the water like this. It was on a marine rail system. Here's the original propeller, still intact. The original propeller is not be used on the restored vessel because it was cracked, but it is still in the Museum of Lake Minnetonka's possession, which owns the Minnehaha currently. Here is the crew standing proudly in front of the Minnehaha at the end of the day's work. So this is flash forward now 10 years into the future, even more than 10 years. This was like 1992 or 1993, probably 1993. They had started basically rebuilding the boat piece by piece, which is how it's considered a restoration, is that instead of building a brand new boat, it was actually the pieces that had to be replaced were replaced piece by piece. And they actually did keep quite a few planks originally, and there are a lot of other original parts of the boat that are still in the restored vessel. So it is considered a restoration and not a rebuild. At first, I think it was a number I've heard before is about 10% of the boat was original, between 10 and 20%, which for a wood boat restoration is actually a lot. Usually it's 0% original. Here are some of the people, some of the work going on through the restoration project. On the left, and I think it's the same guy on the far right too, that's Bob Dumas, and he was a carpenter he built streetcars earlier in his life, and during the restoration of the Minnehaha, it kind of came as second nature for him to build the superstructure of the restored Minnehaha, because it was what he did as a career in the earlier part of his life. So we really have him to thank for rebuilding the Minnehaha's cabin as it is today. This is a photo also in about 1993. This is after they had installed the boiler and the steam engine. Now this engine here was it's not original to the Minnehaha, but it's almost identical to what would have been in the vessel to begin with originally. A triple expansion steam engine. This one's a triple expansion double action steam engine. If you know about steam engines. Basically, what that means is that the steam gets recycled, or it goes through the pistons 3 times. So there's 3 pistons, and it expands as you get further and further. This engine was built in 1944, circa 1944, and it was built by the O'Connor Company, and it was used as a training engine for the U.S. Navy at the end of World War II. But other than using for a couple of training sessions, perhaps, or maybe it was used a little bit more than that, but never got any heavy use by any means. It just sat in a museum or in storage for all the other years. And it was arranged in the early 1990s when the boat was being restored for this engine to be shipped to Minnesota. And it was really it was a perfect engine that they got. It fit perfectly, and it was very close to what would have been there originally. It had just the right amount of power for the restored vessel. And that was really a fluke to get that. Here's kind of the restoration crew, some of the members at least, as they were framing out the cabin. Speaking of the engine, that was kind of when they lowered the engine into the restored hull. That was many people have told me that was really the point when this project became less of a crazy dream and more of a reality that was going to happen. So that was really a turning point for the whole project. Was when they got the engine put in. There's a couple more members of the restoration crew. That's Bob Woodburn on the left. He did all of the electrical systems on the restored vessel, as well as many other projects on the boat. Here are the guys putting in the railings up on the top deck. This is one of the last parts of the project. The final touches. Some other guys down on the bottom, the hull people down on the bottom of the boat below the hull. And, many people who were involved in this project will tell you to this day that this project, that the barn really smelled like vinegar, like pickles and vinegar, because they actually had material for the hull, for the restored hull, donated from the pickle vat company based in, I think it's Chaska or Shakopee is where it's based out of. Forgive me for not remembering. But it was all these recycled pickle vat barrels wood was reused for the hull, so the barn smelled like vinegar throughout the whole project. And that's the thing, people will tell you that to this day. Here are this is when a couple of the first crew members were kind of licensed or officially approved to be crew members. This is before the boat in the water. But that the man with the hat on the left is that's Jim Ogland, who was the first captain of the restored Minnehaha. He was the captain on the lake trials in 1995. And it was literally uncharted water that they were going into because they had no idea how the boat would operate. But Jim, who has now passed, he was a masterful captain, did well with the unknown. The woman with the hat there, that's Laurie Hammond, who was another one of the kind of leaders involved, definitely towards the end of the project. One of the first licensed captains of the boats as well. And the man in the red sweatshirt in the back, that's Leo Maloche, the director of the Minnehaha restoration project. Here's the boat coming out of the barn in Excelsior for the first time in 1995. You can see there was a big crowd and much curiosity when it was coming out like this. Towed out with a World War II era tow truck. Saw some of the people in front of the boat on the same day. This was a big day for everyone involved. This is when they started towing it to the lake now. So they started towing it, and then it ended up at the water. And this is video taken by Jim Ogden.
Starting to move in now. Lines are on. And hopefully we have enough. Wait a little bit till it gets a little closer now.
But he ran out of tape because that was before digital. times, so I suppose he just ran out of tape, unfortunately. But this is a beautiful photograph, courtesy of Jeff Bipes, one of our engineers on the Minnehaha. And this was taken, this is in 1914, or I mean, excuse me, not 1914, 2014, 100 years later, 2014. And this is what it looks like, or basically every year when the boat has gotten launched, at least during years when it is operating. Beautiful photograph. And this is a photograph. This is back to 1996 now, and this was the first time that Minnehaha, the restored Minnehaha, was fired up. Just hours after she was fired up and underway for the very first time. This would have been September 1st, 1996, with Jim Ogland as the captain.
In 1990, the Minnesota Transportation Museum took title to the Minnehaha, whereas a group of dedicated volunteers with a vision, under the leadership of Leo Malash, began the extraordinary feat of restoration. And whereas after 6 years and over 80,000 hours of volunteer efforts, along with $500,000 of support from individuals, corporations, and the Minnehaha once again proudly plies the waters of Lake Minnetonka. Now, therefore, I, John E. Anderson, Mayor of the City of Excelsior, on behalf of the City Council, do hereby proclaim Saturday, May 25th, 1996, as Minnehaha Volunteer Recognition Day in Excelsior.
Louise, will you do us the honor of breaking this bottle of champagne against the hull of the Minnehaha?
She's so frail.
I think we're ready. 1, 2, 3. Louise, can you strike the boat with the bottle? The Streetcar Steamboat Minnehaha to our volunteers and the many, many supporters, our community, and the world.
So this is kind of the end of my presentation here, and it's just a nice comparative picture of the original Minnehaha in 1906 compared to the restored Minnehaha in 2017, I believe is when that photo was taken. Said earlier, I may have been muted. Minnehaha is an authentic steam vessel, and she's very unique, very important part of Minnesota's maritime heritage, as she is the only passenger-carrying commercial steam vessel that is homeported in the state today. And it has been a wonderful thing for the past 25 years on Lake Minnetonka. Now that it's 2021. She did operate on the lake until 2019. That was her final season, so far, at least. She did not operate in 2020, unfortunately, and likely is not operating this year as well. But we can field a couple questions about that with the Museum of Lake Minnetonka representatives that we have on the second tier. But with that, I would like to end it here and end it with this beautiful photograph by Bob Firth of the Minnehaha, as we love her and have known her for 25 years. So thank you all very, very much. I know this went a little bit long, but it is a very important and special thing for our community, and I hope you all enjoyed this program. Thank you. So I suppose we can start with some historical questions, I suppose. So any questions about the history or whatnot, and then we can move to some other questions after that. Does anyone have any questions? Well, Tom McGee is from the Museum of Lake Minnetonka, and he, I believe, has a little thing to say just explaining the Minnehaha's current situation. He could explain it much better than I could. So Tom, if you wanted to hear a little bit now, please go right ahead.
All right. Well, thank you, Aaron. That was a great job. We appreciate it. And as Aaron mentioned, the Minnehaha did not sail last year, and unfortunately, we have had to cancel the 2021 season. We have lost access to the Shorewood ramp that we have used since 1995. And I think Aaron's presentation did quite a job. That, you know, there was one thing I would add, Aaron, that really the Minnehaha's story is not just about steam, but it's also the evolution of how boats have been designed and built through the years. And we are finding how much of a challenge it is to launch a vessel like Minnehaha today. You know, her work creates unique challenges. Her 6-foot draft, the depth that she requires from the water lane down to the bottom of her keel is unlike any other boat on the lake. And so the board of the Museum of Lake Minnetonka is working to find a new launch site and facility. That effort continues to this day. And it is our goal to get the boat back in the water as soon as possible. Meanwhile, our engineers are doing great work. Just today, they hoisted the rudder back into position after an extended maintenance project that would not have been possible had she not been out for an extended period of time. So work continues on the boat, and we look forward to welcoming you all back on board as soon as we can.
Thank you, Tom. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, I'll thank you all so much once again for joining us tonight. It has been a pleasure, and you know, for our programs that are yet to come this year and in years in the future, we'll be back in person, so we won't have to be fumbling with this virtual stuff any longer. So thank you for bearing with us for the past year as we have all gotten through this. So thank you all once again, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Okay.